Good afternoon, and welcome to TexWorld New York City's educational series presentation, The Green Transition, How Global Legislative Changes Are Revolutionizing the Industry, a Lensing seminar series. This panel will be moderated by Ashley Buchalter, Business Development Manager at Lensing Fibers, Inc. Our panelists are Ned Steiner, Senior Director, International Trade and Governmental Relations at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg, PA, and Hillary Jochmans, Founder, Jochmans Consulting, LLC.
Hi, everybody. So welcome. Yes, they just announced, but I'll repeat. My name is Ashley Buchalter. I'm the Business Development Manager for Lensing Fibers. We are the manufacturers of the branded fibers Tencel Lyocell, Tencel Model, and EcoVero Viscose. So you often see us at your favorite brands woven into the construction of the fabric. We are fiber manufacturers. And today I have with me on the panel, Hillary.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
And Ned.
Good morning, everyone.
Could you guys each please just tell a little bit about your background and why you're here today?
Hi, I'm Hillary Jochmans. I am a government affairs consultant in Washington, but I'm also the founder of Politically in Fashion, which is a community for all those in the fashion industry, whether you be a designer, a manufacturer, retailer, or consumer, to learn about and engage on legislative and regulatory issues that are important to the industry. And I'm so honored to be here today. I look forward to this conversation. And I gotta say, last time I was at the Javits Center, it was 15 years ago. I was probably sitting right over there taking the New York State bar exam. And so far, this is a much nicer experience. So thanks for having me back.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ned Steiner. I'm with Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg, which is a trade and customs law firm. I myself am a trade advisor and consultant and lobbyist. And we deal with trade of all kinds, including textile and apparel. And I'm very happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you guys. Yeah, I wanted to reintroduce everybody so that we could really get into what we're going to talk about here today, which is legislation. So for the past 10 plus years, there's been a lot of talk about sustainability and specifically in the fashion industry about what to do about our own footprint. In the past 5 or so years, we've seen things moving from talk to research, science-based targets, and now into legislative action and policy making. So we wanted to have more of a conversation about what it really means. My question for you is, we're doing a lot of business in specific regions where we're selling product, but products are being manufactured globally. So what does it really mean kind of for the whole supply chain, given that it's a global enterprise?
Well, I think, the watchword really is supply chain visibility and being able to trace product and understand where it comes from, not just where it's shipped from, but where the components are coming from. And that's going to be a key element to whatever kind of environmental related legislation will come out. And something that I wanted to highlight maybe later in the conversation is we can see what Congress has done in the past, and that might give us an idea of where it might go with respect to environmental legislation.
Here in the United States. Right.
Here, yeah.
I think supply chain is a great way to sort of visualize the whole situation, right? I mean, really, it's a continuum of issues, and public policy, there's implications for public policy at every point along the way, from the design to the manufacture to the transportation to what you can say about it, how do you protect it physically and IP-wise. So it's a real whole gamut of issues, and I look forward to getting into those a little bit more later on.
Wonderful, thank you. So my next question really has to do with the social side of fashion production. So how do you see this in relation to environmental policies, past and present, that might be a part of this when it comes to labor practices globally?
Well, as I was saying about with supply chain visibility, you can really see where how government is thinking, where government is heading with the way that they're dealing with the forced labor issue, for example. And we can see that first with withhold release orders, which are essentially holds at the border on a company by company basis if forced labor is suspected to be used in the product. And there's also the very mellifluously named UFLPA related to the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And that has to do more with the prohibitions of using certain components from Xinjiang province, which I'm sure everyone is well aware of. But what's happening in the labor sphere is a good indicator of what we might see in environmental policy.
Do you want to play off that at all?
Sure. I'm going to actually use this opportunity to take a step back and just think about sort of contextually as we're talking about legislation. We're going to focus really on primarily on the U.S. in our talk now, but 2024 is an election year, not only here but in many countries throughout the world, and that's going to be very impactful on public policy and legislation. For us here in the U.S., we have the presidential election. We have all 435 House members are up for re-election. 1/3 of the U.S. Senate's up for re-election, and countless state houses and city councils, throughout the country are up for re-election. And so what does this mean? When you're campaigning, you have to have something to run on. It can't just be we avoided a government shutdown and we can't seem to manage to fund anything. You need some sort of record. So members are going to be looking for areas, public policy areas, where they can find some commonality across the aisle. And this may be a space, some of this legislation, where you can find that kind of commonality. Maybe it's on trade issues, maybe it's on environmental protection issues, things like that. So it's something to be watching for this year.
So you're saying like going beyond state by state? Because there are state level now things that are in place in California. In New York, they're trying to pass certain pieces of legislation which haven't made it very far.
Right.
But maybe, so you're saying this might be something that could be nationally put out, or?
Well, I just find an election year, there's a real impetus to get things done. You've got to have some sort of deliverables. And so maybe you see a little bit more movement on some legislation. And we don't know. The president could change, the Congress could change, your state legislator could change. So folks want to get things sort of settled now to the extent they can.
Yeah, and do you think that would be more at the labor side or more of the carbon emissions side, science-based targets, like working at the factory level, or maybe shipping level?
It could be different at different, maybe one issue in the state will take on more of an urgency, like in California, we have legislation on EPR that may really take off this year. Maybe at the national level, maybe they finally do something more on trade, maybe a little bit more on supply chain protections. Definitely, I think we're going to see some movement this year on the green guides. We can get into that later. I think different issues at different points in the political spectrum, but definitely I see the opportunity for momentum this year.
If I could just follow up on that, I think what's important to understand is that the impetus behind this environmental legislation isn't just based on a progressive, pro-environmental position or responding to consumer or private sector interest and demand in having clarity in terms of legislation or regulation, but it also dovetails with the political convergence, if you will, on environment as not only intrinsically beneficial, but also it aligns with the geopolitical situation, particularly as it relates to China. So you have, for example, these pushes on addressing carbon emissions. Some of that is being sold as a way to distinguish U.S. production, which may have less emissions than Chinese production, for example, or other ways to, quote unquote, level the playing field. And so I think it's really important to understand that, because if there is legislation that comes out of this period, it will in all likelihood be related to some kind of fair trade initiative connected in all likelihood with China, or also Russia to some extent, but less in the textile apparel environment. But I think it's important to keep that in mind. So it's almost like be careful what you wish for.
Well, wouldn't
because-
that affect anyone still primarily using coal, like in their regions, if there was something carbon emissions related?
Well, the carbon emissions would be, I think, more sort of specific sector related, like the way that the EU is doing. And the US is trying to figure out a way to respond to that. Hasn't quite figured out what way. It has some ideas, it has some proposals, but they haven't sort of found their way yet. But again, US Congress is very much focused on responding to Chinese dominance in certain areas. And as we can see, it's using kind of every tool in the toolbox to address that issue.
Got it, understood. Okay, so my next question here, you mentioned the FTC Green Guides. So in the US, the Green Guides are due to be released at any moment. In Europe, they've already come out. And it's already affecting policymaking and even legislation that's going to be rolled out in 2026. So for anyone here in the audience that's doing business and wholesaling into Europe, what are some things that they really need to be considering now?
So let me take a step back. Just for anyone who doesn't know, the FTC is the Federal Trade Commission here in the U.S., based in Washington, D.C., and they are responsible for, among other things, enforcing any violations of unfair and deceptive practices. And so marketing comes under this. And so they, in the 90s, created what's called the Green Guides, which is a document to help businesses understand what they can and can't say about their products, and also for consumers to understand what these terms mean. And they've been updated several times since then. But the most recent review, which has not happened since 2012, the recent review is going on right now. The comment period began at the beginning of 2023. And yes, in theory, they could be released anytime. I think there may still be some more work for them to do. Watch, this afternoon they're going to come out. But I think they still have some other areas that they want to touch on before they release their final regs. But those will really provide some real-world impact on how businesses operate. This is not theoretical public policy conversation. This is what you can and cannot say about your product. And what's happening in the US with the Green Guides, as Ashley touched on, the UK has their Green Code, which is sort of their version of the Green Guides, and that was updated, I think, about 2 years ago. And then just last week, the EU got one step closer to effectively banning, quote, greenwashing, which means any kind of comments that you make about eco or green or sustainable is going to have to be backed up with actual facts and information. So it's going to be interesting to see how that's implemented and to the extent that that impacts U.S. businesses. Because even if we don't have our own rules on the books yet in the U.S., companies, my guess would be they're not going to have two different standards, right? So that everyone's going to sort of end up adopting whatever the most stringent standard is, and right now that'll be what's happening.
If they make it to sell in Europe, perhaps they're going to also want to make it to sell it here and anywhere else. Why do it twice?
Yeah, and just to underline what Hillary said, I'm walking up and down the aisles here, and I'm seeing sustainable this and eco that and recyclable this, and a lot of these are claims that must be justified and that must be substantiated in terms of the packaging and the lettering, in some cases the size of the lettering, and the certain claims. I remember when there were a number of sock companies who will go nameless, who would say, they would highlight how their rayon product had these natural antimicrobial properties. And then FTC came along and said, well, actually, rayon in its finished form does not have the same properties that bamboo does, and so you can't make those claims. And people had to go into the retail stores and put a sticker on top of their socks that said, rayon made from bamboo, and specify that it wasn't bamboo. And that's actually kind of an interesting general point, is you need to make sure that your marketing folks aren't getting ahead of your compliance people. And the compliance people are always seen as, a pain. You're saying what I can't do. You're raining on my parade. You're a cost center. You're not making me any money. But guess what? Compliance people are keeping you out of danger. They're keeping you out of... because if you get too far out over your skis, someone's going to come back and they're going to bite you. And so the green guides, I think, is just a continuation of that. It's going to specify when you can say that something is using recyclable material.
Or it won't.
Or it won't.
You know, in 2012, when they updated the guides, FTC affirmatively said, you know, this term sustainable, we just don't have enough information. We're not going to touch it. And now you see the preference of that term, not just in fashion and textiles, but, you know, you see it in travel and food and places like that. So I think it's going to be really interesting if they sort of kick the can on defining that word, or how they're sort of going to nuance that, especially when the UK and the EU are coming out with pretty definitive guidelines for how you can use that term.
Yeah, thank you. This is very, very interesting. And when you said kick the can, it made me think again how we're really, some pieces of legislation are kicking it all the way up to the brand or the retailer, who is kind of the person communicating to the consumer. But they need to have their traceability in line. They need to make sure their marketing isn't getting ahead of their compliance. So my kind of last question here before we open it up to the audience is just maybe one or two things that you're now talking with your clients about in order to help prepare them for what's in the pipeline.
Sure. Well, again, it goes back to my initial point, which is the supply chain visibility. Understanding what's going on, not just one or two steps, but also understanding where your components are coming from. You know, something that we talked about before is the Lacey Act. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Lacey Act. It's about controlling the use of plant product. It's been mostly focused on wood, but understanding the origin of the plant product and whether or not that plant product has been legally harvested. And that's been a real issue, particularly in the wood world, musical instruments, furniture, but they're phasing in compliance, and it's getting further and further away from the tree. So it'll be very interesting to see what are the next implications of that, products using plant and wood products. So one of the things that I also wanted people to come away with today is this, on the one hand, you have government saying it's a good thing, we want you to use sustainable materials, we want you to recycle, but at the same time, they're saying, yes, but if you don't tell us what the origin of that good is, we're gonna ding you, and yes, we want you to do recycling, but you also have to tell us where all this cotton came from. So there's put it mildly, a disconnect between some of the policy objectives and some of the ways that those are implemented. And I would just encourage people to be active and vocal about that with your representatives, both on the state level, but also on a federal level. Happy to talk with people afterwards about that, because there's a lot going on in Washington, and in all likelihood, it will affect your business and the way that you do business.
And I guess you better use a traceable fiber like Tencel. No, I'm kidding. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Ned just said, but having these conversations is really important. It's not theoretical anymore. Legislation is happening, regulation is happening. So it's great that we're having these conversations here amongst practitioners, as I like to call folks, who are the designers and the manufacturers. But you know who's not here? I don't think there are any elected representatives here. So we need to make sure that they are hearing what these conversations are. And that's where I'm seeing a disconnect, where they're not getting that message up there. Because, think about all the different issues legislators work on. This is just one of 20, 50, 100. You need to make sure that your message is getting up there so they can figure out how to write this legislation, how to make it workable. Because like Ned's saying, if you write something that you can't possibly implement, then that's almost worse than nothing. We're going backwards. So to really have that conversation and to engage.
Okay, well, that was my last question, and there's a lot to think about, and I'm sure there's probably a lot of questions. So Eileen, is there a mic for people? Eileen and Malvina, how dare you? Is there a mic for people that we can pass around? Okay, does anyone have a hand up? There you go.
It on? Yes.
I'm teasing you. I'm teasing you.
Hi, I was wondering if you know of anything in the works in terms of incentivization for companies, for instance, preferential status with duty, et cetera.
I couldn't hear that last part.
For instance, preferential status, duty savings. I know that there's also been a push to help incentivize moving to preferential fibers.
Well, there's certainly some plans, legislation for incentivizing reshoring and, making factories, sort of retrofitting some factories to make them more technologically advanced, make sure that the folks working there are trained and ready to work. There's some grant programs in place now, and then the Fabric Act, which Senator Gillibrand has introduced. She has 2 sections in there on tax incentives and various other programs for, like I said, reshoring and worker training.
I think that's a great idea, and there's not enough being done on that. I think part of it, and it's been handled by the private sector for the most part, I think, in terms of being retail driven and brand driven. I think, as I said before, you have to think about I'm going to ask you to get in the head of a legislator, which is kind of a scary place these days. But you have to think about where they're coming from and what their constituents are asking for. And as Hillary was saying, there's an interest in onshoring, however you want to characterize that, using local materials, local being U.S. domestic. And I think they're grappling with that. And I think there is an idea, the direction that we are going in is that, well, if you use U.S., that necessarily is going to be a more environmentally friendly input because it uses less water, is more efficient in energy, you have a better, greener footprint, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, that's more of a sort of a confluence, but not explicitly in legislation. I think there's some states that are working on that a little bit more in terms of water usage, and it starts with data collection, though, for sure. And people are starting to ask, for example, you're talking about carbon. There is a lot of interest in carbon border adjustment, following what the Europeans are doing. And the U.S. is now starting to talk about emissions and trying to get a handle on what are the industries that are the biggest emitters, what are they doing to control emissions. And from that, I think there's this idea that once they identify that and can make the argument that the U.S. is better at that, then there'll be some kind of legislation saying, not that we want to favor the U.S., but we want to favor these lower emitters who happen to be American producers. So there's this idea that there's going to be this confluence. I don't know if that is necessarily the case, but I think that people see this as a competitive advantage.
I just want to pick up quickly on the states issue. I think, Ned and I are both in Washington, D.C., but the states are really important players here. And, the old saying that the states are the laboratory of democracy. A lot gets done at the state level, for better or for worse, because you may have different standards throughout the country. But you're seeing some really innovative ideas progressing in state houses. And so definitely, engage with your local representatives on these issues. I mean, and some states are really big in this area too. You look at North Carolina with their textile manufacturing, look at Michigan, what they're doing in Detroit, in Pennsylvania, Philly, Nashville and Tennessee. So it's all over the country. And then some states are moving forward recycling for textiles or non-textiles, plastics, also PFAS chemicals.
So these are statewide tax initiatives.
Or state bills.
PFAS is national now, so.
Okay.
Yeah, but New York has a particularly aggressive one, yes, on what you can have. and the
California
timeline.
also.
Yeah.
So basically, the tax incentives may or may not be coming down the pike. That's because that was your question, sort of. Did we answer it? Okay, good. All right, we got it.
All right, we'll stop.
All right. Okay, next person.
Hello. Hi. My name is Shreya. It's nice to meet you guys. Question. What is the purpose of clothing? Why do we wear clothes?
Probably shelter. It's probably stay warm.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We got to solve one of those. You're looking at me so strangely.
Want to know where you're going with this?
Oh, fashion, clothing, money as well. My initial question that I was too scared to ask was, as we continue with innovations in the fashion world, like the CO2 little box of technology from one of the booths, that was pretty cool. Things are getting expensive. I'm young. I was a child during like 2008, so this is like my first inflation of the world. And it's really hard to be sustainable when it's expensive. So obviously be sustainable, but why? And why in clothing? That's why we're here.
Okay, so you can always shop secondhand, which is what I still do when I feel like I don't have the money to buy the really nice dress that I want that's made with eco materials. So you can always do that. Exactly. And also, you know, it's okay. I think we're very trend, especially the younger generation. You know, we're used to wanting to look very new every day, and it has to be something new every day. But I think that doesn't have to be the case, and I think you even see people trending more towards wearing the same piece in different ways. So there's ways to be fashionable and still be on a budget. But where is sustainability going? How does fashion fit into that? These are really awesome questions, like larger questions that you're asking. And are you in textiles? Are you at FIT or? What's AR/VR? Okay, well maybe we can just all be naked and you can plaster some cool clothes on me in the future. I think that somebody put that forth one year. Who else?
Here we go.
I mean, the world economy depends on the clothing industry. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. The world economy. I think maybe a better way to phrase that question too, though, is also look at how our global legislative mandates going to drive up costs of our industry potentially, or how will it help us become better streamlined?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because, you know, obviously inflation, we're talking about getting in the head of a legislator. Inflation is top of mind, and cost of living and quality of living. But I think that it's also clashing with, for example, current policy vis-a-vis China, and just in general, the idea of creating new regulations, new mandates for rules of origin. All of these cost money, and all of this gets translated into higher prices for consumers. So I think, but we're not at the point yet where consumers are saying that they're willing to pay a higher price to fulfill all of these governmental mandates. So it will be interesting to see how policy develops if price continues to go up. Because right now, the increase in prices has not affected U.S. Policy in terms of trade compliance. And there's a question mark, is at what point, you know, for example, there is an added tariff on many products coming from China of up to 25%. And there is no discussion about how that's affecting consumers. And very little discussion about how that's affecting consumers. It's mostly couched in the language of unfair trading practices, and China is taking business and employment away from the United States, et cetera. So it'll be interesting to see if that policy has its desired effect, and there is an increase in price, how consumers respond to that. But I think it's a very good question. I don't think we've gotten there yet.
And I think there's also a shorter and longer term cost, right? I mean, there's a short term cost that, yes, this dress might cost more, but the longer term cost, are we making investments in our future, in the planet, things like that are, it's sort of hard to, you can't really legislate morality here, but, if you put a value on what you're buying, and sort of getting to your question before about, why do we have fashion, why do we have clothes? If you value the pieces that you buy and you think about, like, this is my money that I'm spending on this. Somebody made this someplace in the world. This isn't a piece of trash. Don't treat it like it. Don't price it like it. And if you have some value associated with it, it's about value of work, it's value of product, value of time. We may start to shift the mindset a little bit. Legislation will help with that, but it's also part of just a collective society, how we think about and value products and people and time.
Telling better stories, better consumer education about the products that you're making. But how much time do we have?
You still have 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Let's go.
Well, I just want to follow up on that also, is that there's been, when you're talking about price, cost, it's the larger organizations that are able to absorb that, right? Because especially in textile apparel, where you operate on very slim margins, you can't pass it on to the consumer because they're just not going to buy it. So I think we'll see that's going to have an effect on the market, and you're going to see that in the form of consolidation. And the irony is that when you put these price pressures on the market, the folks who get hurt the most are small businesses that can't absorb the cost. And so you have this, again, there's this disconnect between these policy objectives. We want to help small business. Well, it's very hard for a small business who can't absorb the cost, can't shift production, and compared to bigger companies that can. So the question is, when is there going to be a feedback loop where policymakers start to understand that, and how is that going to affect? Because also, they're interested in employment, right? And they go around all over the country saying, small business, the backbone of the U.S. economy, and yet small businesses are the ones that are getting hurt with these increased requirements if they don't get support. Maybe part of the solution is to help small businesses in some way, in terms of maybe making special allowances or having support or providing more information, because small businesses don't have teams of compliance officers or the ability to hire people like me to help them navigate this complicated terrain. So hopefully that will start to percolate and it'll get to the real economy.
Okay, I see some questions over here.
Hello, my name is Ksenia. I work for Lion Brothers, and we make embroidery patches and a different kind of labeling. And when I started working there, I found out that we mostly use polyester and recycled polyester. And our factory is located in China. And I was wondering why we're not using cotton. And I was told that, we specifically not buying any cotton because we don't know if it might be done by basically child labor. And it was a shock for me how polyester can be considered, it's recycled, but it can be considered more sustainable and better than a natural fiber. And I started researching and found that sometimes with forced labor, it's really hard to find the source because it can be outsourced to different factory, and you will never know that it was child labor in the first place. How legislature can even sort it through and see that it was done this way? Sorry for the long.
No, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Keep it closer to.
Closer? Okay. It's hard to, because it is so hard to determine, if something was made with child labor. That's why the law was written the way it is. It presumes, if it comes from this one part of China, that it was made with child labor or unfair labor practices. It's called a rebuttable presumption. You have to come in and affirmatively say and prove, no, it was not. They're just making that assumption because it is so hard to trace it. And that's the law that we have right now.
Yeah, and that you have this law, the UFLPA, Uyghur Forced Labor, and then you have the withhold release orders. Now, what's interesting with the whole withhold release orders, they're company specific, and there's a process where you can appeal that, and you can say, no, look here, I'm sourcing, it doesn't come with forced labor, and the government will say, oh, okay, yeah, we see you have the documentation, we will release the goods. You don't have that process in with the Uyghur. They put you in jail, and the burden of proof is on you, and there's an assumption that you're using forced labor. But your point is very, very well taken. It's a challenge, and Congress. Again, you have to understand the mentality. Congress observes this phenomenon of forced Uyghur labor in the Xinjiang province. What do they do about it? And this is what they've done. And the market has responded with saying, well, if that's the case, I'm just not going to use any Chinese cotton because I have no idea where it comes from. So that's an important thing to think about. Is sometimes the way the market it's one thing to think of a piece of legislation. It's another thing how the market responds to that.
Very good. Thank you, guys. Okay, I'll let you. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a difficult conversation. Yeah. So really the elephant in the room is our addiction to overproduction and the fact that we don't really pay the full price for a garment currently. So unfortunately, we have been pushed to legislate because companies aren't deciding to do it themselves. So perhaps just speaking a little bit about how California has started really paved the way with SB 62 as far as some legislation for garment workers made by garment workers to try to help level the playing field as far as there being a base salary and not so much a ceiling. I know that's a lot to say.
What's the question?
It's more I think it's helpful to educate about how legislation can be positive in a way that, because it is confusing, everyone's afraid of the legislation, but by having a more level playing field, it actually would help those manufacturers that are trying to do the right thing.
So more of a comment than a question, maybe. Maybe if you guys agree with that, or if not, we can just. I see what you're saying. Yes, it's not just thinking of it as the stick, but think of it as a carrot, and also think of all the good things that come out of legislation sometimes.
So we'll do one. This will be our last question, okay?
And we'll be here too. We can keep talking. Yeah.
I can ask you guys directly, but this is kind of an extension on her question and a bit about the disconnect between, you mentioned, between the kind of recycling pipeline and the production pipeline and how you get that throughput. I guess, what is the solution that you would propose or that you have seen effective? Should there be more pressure on that transparency? I mean, yes, but is it about disconnecting that ability to recycle the materials from the fact that we know where they came from or whatnot? Should we actually make those two separate pipelines?
Well, I think that again, there are two conversations going on, right? There's the supply chain transparency. We want to know where everything comes from, country of origin, and then there's the recycling conversation, which is let's reuse, repurpose, what have you. And the problem is that you have these trade rules that make that very difficult because, how do you know whether your recycled sock has cotton from Xinjiang province or not, right? So there are a number of ways of tackling that. I mean, there's the traceability, which certainly helps. But then there's also sort of imagining this circular economy. And I think Europe I don't know, just like experimenting with that or trying to figure out a way forward with that. You hear more of that conversation in the United States as well. But there's going to have to be a reconciliation between that conversation and the supply chain conversation and figuring out how the two work together.
Yeah, definitely not an either or. It has to all be together. And we're at a point right now where we can't just talk about recycling because there's a bunch of stuff out there we can't recycle. So we got to deal with already on the planet, and then also be thinking about going forward. How do you design appropriately so that things can be recycled? How do you incentivize folks to do that? So it's a multi-step process.
And that also runs into conversations about intellectual property and about whether you're able to use it and how far do property rights extend. And there are a lot of really fundamental conversations that need to be had that aren't taking place. And again, just to echo what Hillary was saying, it's so important that you get in front of your representatives and tell them what you're doing. Have them understand your story about your operations, about the challenges that you're facing, about your vision for the future. Because I think in some ways a lot of this is the government is playing catch up, which is sort of its nature. I mean, it's always slower than the private sector, but it's really important to get out there.
And to have that conversation early, right? Ideally before there's a crisis, develop that relationship. I know it can seem intimidating or you don't know where to start or scary. Just go online. Everyone's got an email address. You can call them up. You can go to the local office. You don't have to go to Washington. Everyone's got a local office. Go meet there. And half the time you're going to be meeting with somebody like me. That's what I did for a dozen years. And I don't think I'm too scary. So.
All right, thank you guys. I think that's all we have time for, but we're here to talk to, so please come up. Thank you.